Hello and welcome, I'm Kira the Scrivener, and today I'm going to do my November wrap-up in 17 minutes or less, because that is what is on the clock. Okay, so the first book that I have to talk about is The Inconvenient Indian, and this is by Thomas King, and this is a nonfiction book by him. He is like a 78-year-old Canadian who lives like 20 minutes away from me, which is super cool, and he's like, this isn't a history. I'm not telling you a history, I'm telling you an account. Because he's like, I don't really like those pesky things called footnotes, and then people want you to be chronological and all of this crap, and I don't want that. And people always get offended by historians because they disabuse them of their myths. And then he uses, research throughout the thing, and is like, his wife is a historian, so he's like, yes, Helen reminded me that I should really inform you this, and this, and this. And he's like, I also like personal anecdotes. I think that he does a brilliant job of using humor to really hit home in a really, really good way. Often we think of humor as some way that can like lift. In counseling, we talk about like how all the emotions are kind of in the stomach, and we use jokes to diffuse the situation up here so that we don't have to really deal with the problems. But I think that he does a really good job of using the humor to actually bring you down. So he kind of eases you into something, and then he like gut punches you. Not gun punches you, because that sounds emotionally manipulative, and it's not that. He's being very honest and stuff like that. But he will like sarcastically refer to something. Kind of using humor or things like that is when he's talking about how people suppose that we should just not talk about the past and just go forward and like just move forward. And he's like, yes, that's like trying to explain that Hiroshima and Nagasaki got bombed and not explaining the context of World War II. Maybe we should talk about that part. I think joking sometimes can make it almost more useful because you remember the joke. So you remember the historical fact that goes along with it. Now that I've spent most of my allotted time talking about Thomas King, which I have no complaint about, I have another book by him, and that is 77 Fragments of a Familiar Ruin. And this is a collection of poetry that he published, I think, last year. And this is a really brilliant collection of poetry. Halfway through, he tells you now, go back and reread it again. He uses a lot of like longer form things, but then he uses a lot of refrains and stories, and I think that he does a really, really brilliant job. He talks about creation throughout, and like Turtle Island and the kind of ways it is, and like retreats you to how we look at history and stuff like that. And I really, really appreciated it. And one of the ones that I wrote down is, all promises are bruises in good suits. He went to the wedding knowing everything he knew about funerals. And both of them are books that I hope to purchase soon and go through and like highlight and underline, because there was just so much. Like, I read Fragments, but I read it on ebook, so I didn't have the ability to write nearly as much as I would have loved to make notes in the margins. Moon on the Crusted Snow by Wabasing Rice, and this was quite good. I thought the beginning was hard to get into, but once we got into the story, it went really, really well. It's kind of a dystopian apocalyptic story in which we have this man who begins with telling his story about hunting, and he comes back and the power is out and the TVs are out, and then slowly and slowly more stuff just goes. And then people start coming, and white people start coming, and it is a haunting story of like the end of the world. But one of the elders says in a very remarkable line that this isn't the apocalypse. The apocalypse happened 500 years ago. It happened again when we were taken off our land and we were done all of these things. And beneath there is this idea that we endure, we go on, we continue, but there is also this chilling image of this man Scott who has come in and kind of forced himself into the community, and how his thing in contemporary Canada kind of reasserts almost the dynamic with colonialism, where he comes in and is like, I know how to do things better, I'm going to do these blank, 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 and kind of forcing himself into the things and disrupting things and ruining the sacredness of it, I would say. The ending is quite chilling, and then the ending is kind of hopeful, and I appreciated that. It landed about a 3-star for me, primarily because it was so sparse in its language, and the beginning almost was told exclusively through dialogue, which was a little rough. I often find that dialogue-heavy books can be really hard, especially if they're in this where it's realistic, so it's not like people are talking as they're talking, so like, it's not fancy dialogue, it's like, this is mundane dialogue. So once we kind of got into more just exploring the dynamics and like looking at it from a bigger perspective, I actually liked it better. But I am definitely interested to read more of his books. So as a way to be respectful of time, and because I did a bunch of Friday reads throughout, I have actually reviewed a lot of these books before. So I'm going to kind of link all of those, and if you'd want my more detailed views, I will leave them in the description. All Our Relations, and this is by Tana Talega. She is a Canadian author, and she writes about Indigenous issues. And this one is specifically looking at suicide and youth and suicide. It is a hard book to read. It looks not only at Canada, but also in the United States and in Peru and in Norway and Australia, and kind of how colonization and genocide has created mental health in communities, and how do we go forward. The subheading is Path Forward, and I really recommend it. It is a brilliant and well done researched story. The next one is The Snow Line by Tessa McWatt, and she is Indigenous as well as a myriad of other nationalities, and she talks about that in her memoir Shame on Me, which talks about the intersection of being multiracial, which is really cool. This one is set in India in 2008, and it's very interesting. It has this old man who, his wife has died, and he's now looking for a place to find a place sacred enough to put his ashes, and it's about grief, about letting go, and intergenerational friendship. In the end, I wanted more from it, but I think that it was a very interesting novel, and one that I may revisit in the future, because I liked a lot of the characters, but I didn't feel enough resolve, and maybe if I went back to it at a different time, I might see more. But November was rough, and I started this and read about 80% of it and then returned, so that could have also affected my thoughts on it. And then for the final nonfiction book that I have, it is Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists by Mickey Kendall. She is the author of Hood Feminism, a book that I really, really loved, and I really enjoyed this book as well. I have some complaints about it being a little bit too American focused in the 20th century, which I went on and on and on about in the last Friday reads, so I will link that. But overall, I think it was a really good job of being intersectional and telling the stories, and it's a graphic novel, so it's really accessible. It definitely talks about some heavy subjects, but I do think that it's pretty accessible to probably anyone over the age of 8 to 10, and maybe some parental basis for younger kids. I also read some more poetry. The first one was Counting Descent, and this is by Clint Smith, author of How the Word is Passed, and I really, really enjoyed his nonfiction, so I was excited to pick up his poetry. It is really well done. He looks at fragments and renditions, and he's looking at the story of being Black, being a Black man in Philadelphia, and his story and growing up, and it is quite well done. It's another book that I want to purchase and read. Describing poetry is really difficult because there are so many different poems and so many different topics, but I thought it was really poignant and wonderful. The other poetry collection was not completely a poetry collection, and maybe I would have had different thoughts going in, but this is called Norma Jean Baker of Troy, and this combines the story of Marilyn Monroe with the story of Troy and Helen of Troy, and in that case it was really interesting. It is actually an avant-garde play, and it kind of talks about her story, and we have different people going on stage and telling stories, and maybe it would have been better if it was performed, because there was aspects and beautiful poignant lines that just cut to you. I love that Arthur Miller, her third husband and the author of The Crucible and other things, was called Arthur of New York and Sparta, and kind of combining him with different characters and stuff like that. I thought that was an interesting thing. I thought describing Greek and describing a lot of different and using those intersections to discuss social issues was really interesting. I just think that as a play, it didn't fully deliver, and I would have loved a more nuanced view into Marilyn Monroe as a character, into Norma Jean as a character. It was interesting as an experiment, but I only gave it 2 stars. And one of the reasons I was super excited to read this was I had read Snagglepuss, and this is Exit Stage Left, and is by Mark Russell. This was part of the kind of made some more realistic stories of the old cartoons, and this was so well done. This is kind of based on Tennessee Williams and this whole section, and it features Marilyn Monroe as well as other people in this story. It really takes a story of a man who is in the 1950s, who is gay, who is dealing with all of these different things as a poet during the Red Scare and during the time when they're really hitting hard on you. And every single line in this graphic novel is profound. It is so well done, funny, witty, lovely. It has a beautiful atmosphere of the 1950s. It has the beautiful witticisms. I went down so many research holes. I think I started this in September, and I just kept on getting distracted by researching different people mentioned, and it was so cool and so interesting. So I really, really loved it. One of my favorite lines was, "We forget sometimes that characters are not defined by what is unique, but by what is common." That isn't the exact quote, that's a terrible paraphrase, but it's the idea that we so often try to make these characters these grand people, and they're so special, and they're so special, and they're so unique, and really all we want to do is see characters that we see ourselves in. Anne of Green Gables is my favorite book. Anne of Green Gables, the graphic novel, is however not. This one I gave a solid 2.5 stars. I think I generously gave it 3, but I am generously considering rechanging that back, because, guys, I love Anne, and you guys suck at adapting her so much. It's at this point it's practically painful, because everyone loves the whimsy of Anne, which is the great part. I love the whimsy of Anne, but they always forget that there's other character development underneath it, And this one like flattened a lot of her like talking and stuff like that, because there's a lot of beautiful things, and Brenda Thumbler did an excellent job on illustrating this. It was the adapting of the language that I really struggled with, adapting of the story, of like only taking like one great line from a chapter or an instance and trying to make that be the whole instance. And I'm like, yeah, that's a great line, but with no context, it's not a great line. I kind of noticed this throughout. Like, I looked at a bunch of reviews to know that, you know, I fully acknowledge that this is an area of life where I will never, ever be unbiased. We're never, ever going to be completely unbiased anyways, but, like, this situation, I'm never going to be unbiased. And I know so many people who, like, love Anne of the E and, like, love all those other things, and I'm like, I don't understand how you can't see all the problems. And yeah, no. In this case, I'm, like, reading through all of these reviews, and, like, everyone's like, this is so brilliant and wonderful. And then everyone who's, like, read Anne of Green Gables is like, this is pretty, but also read the book. And I hate to say that, but like it also did a weird thing where Anne of Green Gables, the book, takes over 5 years, and they crushed everything into the year. Like, you know, at like the 3/4 mark, they mentioned that she's almost 13 years old, and then we have the scene where she goes to college, and then it's the end, and it's like, so are you saying that she went to college when she was 13? I'm really confused. And there couldn't have been a time gap, which I missed, because they put the thing where she cuts all her hair off, and then when she goes to college, her hair is still short. And I was like, why did you make 13-year-old Anne go to college? She doesn't go there till she's like 15. I'm so confused why you cut 2 years off her time. And like cut off a lot of her like big older moments. Like, we kept all the moments that happened to her when she was 11 and 12, and cut off all of the moments that happened to her when she was 13, 14, and 15, which are like the moments of her maturing and finding out that like she doesn't have to define herself simply by being intelligent and stuff like that. She has value elsewhere, and she's growing, she's maturing, and like the story of one, we cut off all like Marilla's really thoughtful things. And this is also where I think that like Lucy Maud Montgomery does such a brilliant job of setting the scene, of drawing and writing these characters so beautifully. And by choosing to only have dialogue, you miss so much of the beauty around that. And that is pretty much my thought about everything. I believe that narration is necessary, and even in graphic novels, there should be narration. Every graphic novel where there has just been dialogue, I've almost struggled all of the time. So after this one, I decided, you know what, the next course of action is to read a book by one of my other favorite authors that is kind of a picture book. And this is The Sea Prayer by Khaled Hosseini. He wrote one of my other favorite books. Really two of them, depending on the day, find out which book is my favorite, that The Kite Runner and Anne of Green Gables. And this one is based on the story of Alan Kurdi, his life and death. He was a 3-year-old who was leaving Syria and wanted to come into Canada with his father, and he died trying to do that. And this is a really devastating story, but a story that focuses on the hope and the desire, and I think that is so important in Canada or the US or in Britain or in so many countries that accept refugees. You hear so much crap that I'm not even going to repeat about like the drain on the economy and all of this dumb stuff, and I'm like, we forget that people are people when we think of them only as a statistic, as only as a nation, as only as a thing, rather than talking about the stories of why are people trying to leave their country? Why are they willing to risk leaving their country, crossing a sea, doing all of this? Maybe it's because, you know, they have violence or they need things. And having stories especially geared toward children that teach them from a young age to see the humanity in people that are different from them are so important. Also, of course, to tell the story of many of those children who are coming to Canada or coming to other places and want to hear their own story told, to talk about their own wishes, the wishes of their parents or themselves who immigrated to Canada or other places. And I think that that is so important. And now we're just going to take a radical change over to The Joker. And this is a 2021 comic and the Joker's second only exclusive comic that is ongoing. And this one focuses probably not on Joker, but on the trauma he caused. So the main character and the narration is done by Jim Gordon, and he's talking about the experiences of his own trauma with the Joker as well as his daughter Barbara. And he is retired now, and he is learning how to do things, and it is really well done. And I think that you can't really have a story in which the Joker is the main character, because we don't really want to get into that headset of that. So I think that it was a really brilliantly done. It had Punchline in the background, and she's an interesting character developing in the DC universe. So I really enjoyed it. Gave it 4 stars. And then another disappointing graphic novel was Lore Olympus. I know so many people are so excited. My roommate loves it. She bought it and I read it and I didn't love it. I think a big part was that I didn't meld with the art well. Like I I didn't like the art. I like art very much where you can see people's faces very well. You can see their expressions, you can see their humanity. When we get to the more squishy, I don't know the kind of art, I'm not official arty person, but when we get to that kind of more art style, or we get to art style where like when they have excitements and stuff like that, their faces change into different things, it's just not the art for me. And then the big thing is that they played Persephone so young. Like, her mother is overprotective and all of those things. She can't have a cell phone, she can't have an email. And then they group her with Hades, who is mentioned to be a grandfather, or at least Poseidon, and Zeus are mentioned to be grandparents. We see an instance like right before they're trying to make this big romantic thing. You have Hades and Hera talking, but we have Hera as like this grown woman talking to like a small baby Persephone, and it's like, are you supposed to make me root for this by showing that he is like way older than her? And I understand that like in Greek myths there's gonna be an age difference, you're an immortal god, people are happening, but like I wouldn't mind an age difference if she was an established adult. But because they're parenting her like, and I think she's supposed to be 19, but like, girl, I remember being 19 years old and having a 26-year-old hit on me, and I was like, dude, step away. Like, I was uncomfortable with that. I was like, I'm out of high school. Sure, you're attractive, but you are way too old to be hitting on me. And I would feel that way at like 19. I feel that way getting older, of being like, why did so many guys hit on me when I was like 17, 18, 19? Like, that is not okay. So the fact that he is like probably in human years, like in his 60s or at least 40s, and he's hitting on a 19-year-old, I'm like, I can't, guys. Couldn't have you made her like 25, like a little bit more sheltered but independent? Like, it shows that she has some dominion of her own. So like, you could have had her first time going out on her own, but that she's very established in her home turf. But we don't really have her established in her home turf. Instead, we just have her as like this new duckling hatching and being like, old man. Ugh. The last of the graphic novels I have to talk about is Hawkeye, and I have heart eyes for Hawkeye. I'm so weird. Anyways, this is focused on the 2012 series and has Clint and Kate both as Hawkeye, and they are so amazing. I am loving this dynamic. I read all 22 issues plus the few other ones that are in continuation with it, and it was so brilliant and so funny. I loved it. Like, one of my best lines is that Clint is going into this fancy gala to figure things out, and he's just going, casual, stay casual, okay, stay casual. And Kane's like, you know, the least way you can be casual is by muttering casual and walking around. And I will have an entire vlog with me kind of reading dramatic lines and having fun and talking about it, but that is another one. Another thing is he calls Kate his ward. She's like crashing after a mission at the house, and his neighbor comes over and he's like, you remember Kate, my ward? And Kate just takes one look at him and is like, you're what, sir? And I love the call out of Bruce Wayne and all of his little words. It made me laugh so hard. And then I think I have 6 more novels, all of which I have talked a lot about. So I'm going to go over them really quickly. First of all, we have Iron Widow, and this was brilliant. I love this so much. It made me so much happy. It combines mechas and the only female emperor of China into one big beautiful thing where women are being, well, this isn't beautiful, but women are being used as batteries to charge the mechas, and the men are just going on and killing all the women, and that's not good. So this one girl is like, I'm gonna go take revenge, and she goes into this, and it's beautiful and wonderful. It is like so nuanced but also funny and entertaining, and I love the humor, I love the story. I thought all of it was just so well done. It has a beautiful deconstruction of the patriarchy with like it not being like weirdly too obvious. I think that it did it really, really well. And then we have Our Violent Delights by Chloe Gahn. This is the second book in these Violent Delights, and this was just so wonderful. It is a very loose retelling of Romeo and Juliet set in Shanghai in the 1920s. It has everything you would like to know if you like superior, well done fantasy. Historical fiction. It's just so wonderful. I really enjoyed the characters. It does a lot of character work. It does a lot of like beautiful, I don't know, there's just like something I can't really describe, like atmosphere, world building, characters, dynamics. It's all there. It's got the whole package. And then right after that, I read The Magnolia Sword by Sherry Thomas. This is a retelling of Mulan in the 6th century. It does a really good job of confronting biases and looking at the story. I also like that it takes the angle of her being raised as a boy from a young child because her twin brother died and her father was like, you know what, I could use a dude. So she does that, and it also has her father being disabled and stories around that and her just kind of confronting, and I really, really enjoyed it. The author in herself, in her author note, talks about how she had a lot of thoughts about what it meant to be Chinese and learned a lot more about herself in that, and then used it to kind of use it as a framework to talk about expanding your horizons, and it's so excellent. And then we have Ghost Forest, and this is a Canadian novel that takes an unnamed narrator whose father has died, and we don't get a lot about her, we get a lot about the dynamics. It's really told in vignettes. Her father stayed in Hong Kong when she moved to Canada and was raised in order so that she could be supported, and now her father has died and it's caused a lot of strain and stuff like that, and she's really trying to get to know herself, trying to get her know her, and it's just a lot of complicated feelings about growing up and identity and about heritage and like how do you navigate these complicated family things. I thought it was really, really well done. The Days of Aphrodite is in conversation with Mrs. Dalloway and Sula and Zami, and is such a brilliant story. I really love the way that Sally Solomon took all of these stories and kind of integrated, so we're really anchored in the present moment where this middle-aged black woman who is married to a white guy, and he is about to get arrested for embezzlement. She never really planned to marry him. They were good friends and she was a lesbian, although this conversation around sexuality is very much left open, and she was in love with this girl in college, and we kind of look at both of their stories. It's like a very interesting story where we use this anchor of the moment of her husband about to be arrested to look at so many of these different moments in each of their lives and how their lives came in different ways. And she homages all of these different things while they're also like English majors, so they discuss all of these things, and it's so well done and so beautiful. And then last, and certainly not least, we have A White Ivy, which is definitely up there with one of my new favorite novels. I really, really love it. And this is a story about Ivy, who's born in China and spends her first, I think, 4 or 5 years there, and then her parents, who were working in America, send over for her, and she's like, I don't know these people at all. I was raised by my grandmother, and she starts thieving when she's a small child, and she gets into a prep school, but she's like the only Asian kid there, and she kind of really deals with all of these things and feeling like she has to perfect this image of herself. And in my Friday reads, I talked a lot about the Great Gatsby comparison because Claire Reeds did this brilliant depiction of how she related to like Gatsby and how he kind of changed all of these things about himself to appeal, but she is a woman in the 21st century. I think actually more about like 2010, like, so I think it takes place in the 90s, and then it jumps 10 years ahead and she's in her late 20s, and she begins this relationship with this like prominent Virginian man who's wealthy and stuff like that, and she's kind of changing herself and moving herself to be the perfect person to receive this American dream. And I really loved the exploration of dynamics through that. I hope that you had a brilliant November, and let me know which was your favorite book you read in the month. Happy reading and writing, and I'll talk to you next time.